But on a sticky August morning in 2023, the lightning-fast draw technique he'd perfected for 12-foot gators found a very different mark. His deckhand, Junior, took a point-blank shotgun blast to the abdomen in an accident that nearly killed 2 men and forced Willie to finally face the brutal truth about what his obsession with speed had really cost him. The shot that stopped production the morning of August 17, 2023 started like thousands of others. Willie Edwards had spent the night preparing to hunt alligators in Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin. His boat was loaded with gear, his crew was ready, and Swamp People cameras were rolling, just as they had been for over a decade, capturing the routine that television audiences found exotic and dangerous, but that Willie had performed so many times it had become almost automatic. Muscle memory took over, actions executed faster than conscious thought could register what his eyes were seeing or what his hands were doing. The crew that morning included Willie's son, Little Willie, and Randy. Junior Edwards, Willie's nephew, who was in his mid-30s but still carried the nickname Junior, despite having spent more than enough years on gator boats to have earned any name suggesting youth or inexperience. Junior was up front handling the lines. His job was to pull hooked gators close enough for Willie to deliver the kill shot with the bang stick, a specialized weapon that fires a shotgun blast on direct contact. The technique demands perfect timing and precision to be effective, humane, and safe for the shooter and everyone else crowded onto the small boat. What happened next unfolded so quickly that even the high-definition cameras filming from multiple angles couldn't fully capture the chain of tiny errors that turned a routine kill into catastrophe. The footage shows Willie bringing the bang stick up in the smooth, flowing motion that had become his signature, the same move Swamp People editors had replayed in slow motion countless times to highlight his skill and his almost casual comfort with a weapon that could be as deadly to the user as to the target. But something went fatally wrong in the execution. Willie's muscle memory and his lifelong competitive drive to be faster than any other gator hunter created conditions where split-second timing, which normally separated a clean kill from a dangerous struggle, instead separated another normal day from a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved. The bang stick fired before Willie had fully confirmed his target. The shotgun blast struck Junior in the lower abdomen as he was still bent forward handling the line, occupying the exact space Willie's peripheral vision should have registered as too close to where the weapon was pointing. But his focus on speed and his assumption about where everyone should be positioned prevented him from actually seeing and processing the danger before his finger finished the trigger pull that decades of practice had made completely automatic. The blast was instantly followed by Junior's scream and the horrifying sight of blood spreading rapidly across his shirt. The wound was severe enough that everyone on the boat immediately understood this was a life-threatening emergency, not a minor injury that could be patched with first aid and reassurance. Little Willie's reaction was immediate and almost certainly saved Junior's life. His training as a volunteer EMT and his presence of mind, even after watching his father shoot his cousin, allowed him to apply pressure to the wound, assess the damage, and shout at Willie to get the boat moving toward the nearest place they could meet an ambulance that Little Willie was already calling for over the radio. Willie stood frozen for critical seconds, the bang stick still in his hands, his face showing pure shock and horror at what he had just done. His legendary quick reflexes and lifetime of split-second decisions completely failed him now that the situation demanded emotional processing instead of practiced physical technique. The Swamp People production crew in the chase boat stopped filming immediately and shifted to emergency coordination. The producer began making urgent calls to the network's legal department and local authorities while the cameraman, who moments earlier had been capturing routine gator hunting, suddenly found themselves documenting a medical crisis that immediately raised serious questions about liability and whether the pressure to produce dramatic footage had contributed to an accident by encouraging Willie to prioritize speed and showmanship over careful target confirmation. The fastest gun in the bayou. Willie Edwards earned his reputation as Louisiana's fastest gator hunter across decades of competition, both formal tournaments and informal bragging rights in swamp communities where such skills mattered deeply and where being the quickest or most accurate carried real weight among men whose identities were tied to their mastery of dangerous, traditional work. His perfected bang stick technique required bringing the weapon from ready position, acquiring the target, and making contact in one fluid motion, the entire sequence taking experienced hunters perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, but Willie had refined his approach until he could execute it in under a second when conditions were ideal and his confidence was high. Swamp People editors had celebrated that speed as proof of his expertise and entertainment value, something that set him apart from other hunters whose more methodical approaches didn't translate as dramatically on camera. Producers had encouraged Willie to talk about his technique and demonstrate his quick draw ability, often including slow-motion replays that emphasized how much faster he was than anyone else. That created a powerful narrative, Willie as the supremely skilled operator whose confidence and ability justified aggressive methods that might look reckless when performed by less experienced hunters. But what the celebration of his speed had hidden was the growing carelessness that had crept into his technique over the years. Countless successful kills had reinforced his belief that his reflexes and experience made careful target confirmation unnecessary, that he could trust his peripheral vision and assumptions about crew positioning rather than taking the extra fraction of a second to consciously verify before firing a weapon designed to kill 1,200-pound reptiles and that would obviously cause catastrophic damage if misdirected at a human being. Other hunters had noticed and occasionally commented that Willie's technique was getting sloppy, that his focus on speed was creating dangerous situations where crew members were at risk if anything deviated from expected patterns. The competitive side of Willie's personality made him resistant to any suggestion that he should slow down or change a method that had worked thousands of times across his 4-decade career. When other hunters began appearing on Swamp People and viewers started comparing techniques online, debating who was truly the best, Willie responded by doubling down on his quick-draw style and taking even greater risks to prove his speed and confidence were justified by results no one else could match. Family members, including little Willie, had privately expressed concern about Willie's increasingly aggressive approach. Their conversations about safety were dismissed by the patriarch, who interpreted caution as criticism of his abilities and suggestions to modify his technique as accusations that age and slowing reflexes were diminishing him. The generational tension between Willie's old-school confidence and his son's more safety-conscious mindset had created friction that Swamp People cameras occasionally captured, but that editing usually minimized because family conflict complicated the show's narrative. About Louisiana heritage and traditional skills being passed down through generations, Junior had worked alongside Willie for more than 15 years. His familiarity with his uncle's techniques and his own experience handling lines should have made him safe from the kind of accident that ultimately happened, because he understood Willie's patterns and knew where to position himself to stay clear of the bang stick's discharge zone, but familiarity had also bred complacency. Both men assumed their long history working together meant they didn't need to maintain the careful spatial awareness and communication that would have prevented Junior from being in the line of fire if the weapon discharged even slightly off target or if timing was off by a fraction of a second. The pressure from Swamp People production to capture dramatic footage had helped create an environment where taking risks felt acceptable, because previous seasons had shown that exciting content drove viewer engagement and that Willie's aggressive style was part of what made him compelling television. Producers' occasional requests for him to do that quick kill thing or demonstrate his speed for cameras positioned to catch the action had reinforced Willie's belief that being fast was more important than being careful, and that his reputation depended on maintaining the image of the supreme hunter whose reflexes and confidence set him apart from slower, more cautious operators. The 3 seconds that changed everything. The forensic reconstruction, built from multiple camera angles, revealed exactly how Willie's quick-draw technique ended up shooting Junior instead of the gator. Frame by frame, Analysis showed a sequence of small errors and misjudgments that combined into a catastrophic breakdown of the safety protocols that should have made injuring a crew member impossible. The reconstruction begins roughly 3 seconds before the shot. Willie's attention was locked on the gator Jr. was pulling toward the boat. The one Willie was preparing to kill with the bang stick he was already bringing into ready position with a motion so practiced he could execute it without consciously thinking about where the weapon was pointing or what might be in its path. At 2.5 seconds before discharge, Junior leaned forward to get a better grip on the line. His movement placed him directly in the path the bang stick would travel as it came up toward firing position, his body occupying space that Willie's peripheral vision should have registered as dangerous. But that his focus on the approaching gator and his complete confidence in his ability to thread the weapon between Junior and the boat's gunwale prevented him from recognizing as a problem requiring adjustment or communication. At 1.8 seconds, the bang stick began its upward arc, moving faster than Willie's conscious mind could process what his eyes were seeing, because decades of practice had created neural pathways that bypassed normal cognitive checks in favor of reflexive execution that was faster but eliminated the conscious verification step that would have caught the error before it became irreversible. The camera footage shows Willie's eyes tracking the gator, but not actually looking at the space the bang stick was moving through. His assumption was that Junior would be where he was supposed to be, not where he actually was. Given the practical realities of handling a powerful, fighting gator that was constantly shifting and requiring constant adjustment, Junior's position changed in a way Willie's muscle memory didn't anticipate. At 0.9 seconds, the bang stick's barrel was pointed directly at Junior's abdomen. The angle and distance meaning that discharge at this point would deliver the full force of the shotgun blast into soft tissue without any deflection or spread that might have occurred at greater range or different angle. Willie's finger was already applying pressure to the trigger mechanism, his muscle memory completing the shot sequence his brain had initiated before fully processing the visual information that should have aborted the technique and triggered conscious override of the automatic response that thousands of successful kills had programmed into his neuromuscular system. At 0.3 seconds. Willie's conscious mind finally began registering that something was terribly wrong. His eyes widened as peripheral vision at last processed that Junior was too close, positioned incorrectly, and that the bang stick was pointing at a human being instead of the gator that was supposed to be the target. But neural signals travel only so fast, and muscles already executing a programmed sequence cannot be stopped instantaneously. The gap between recognition and the ability to abort was measured in milliseconds that simply weren't available given how far the trigger pull had already progressed toward the point of no return. At 0 seconds, the weapon fired. The shotgun blast struck Junior in the lower left abdomen at a range of approximately 18 inches, close enough that the entire payload of buckshot entered his body as a coherent mass rather than spreading across a wider area that might have reduced individual pellet penetration but increased total damage depending on dispersion. The impact threw Junior backward, his grip on the gator line releasing as his body's autonomic systems responded to catastrophic trauma by shutting down non-essential functions and triggering shock that would determine whether he survived the next several minutes before medical help could arrive. The immediate aftermath, captured on camera, shows Willie's face transforming from hunter's focus to pure horror and disbelief. His brain processed what had happened, but his emotions couldn't immediately accept that his quick-draw technique had just resulted in shooting his nephew and potentially killing someone he'd known since birth and worked beside for 15 years. Little Willie's shouting broke Willie's paralysis. His son's commands to drop the bang stick and get the boat moving toward help penetrating the shock and forcing Willie's transition from frozen horror to desperate action that might still save Junior. If they could reach medical care before blood loss or organ damage became irreversible, the aftermath in the swamp, the 30-minute boat ride to the nearest launch, where an ambulance was waiting, felt like the longest period of Willie Edwards' life. Every second stretched into eternity as he watched little Willie working desperately to keep Junior alive while blood continued soaking through makeshift bandages and while Junior's consciousness faded in and out. making communication impossible and leaving it unclear whether he was even processing what had happened or whether shock and trauma had already shut down his cognitive functions. Willie's attempts to help were pushed aside by little Willie, whose EMT training gave him authority that overrode normal family hierarchy in that moment. The son's sharp commands to his father, "Just drive the boat and stay out of the way," carried anger and fear that Willie recognized but couldn't respond to, because acknowledging his son's rage would require processing his own guilt, and that processing would incapacitate him when Junior's survival required everyone to remain functional. The questions Willie couldn't stop asking himself during that endless ride included: why hadn't he taken the extra fraction of a second to verify his target? Why had he prioritized speed over safety when decades of experience should have taught him that no kill shot was worth risking a crew member's life? Why had he allowed television pressure and competitive ego to override basic safety protocols that every responsible hunter follows regardless of how confident they are? But the questions had no answers that could undo what had happened, stop Junior's bleeding, or make the boat move faster through water that seemed determined to resist their desperate rush toward help in a remote area with limited infrastructure, where most serious emergencies ended in death before victims could reach capable medical facilities. The Swamp People producer in the chase boat had maintained radio contact with emergency services, providing updates on Junior's condition and their estimated arrival times so paramedics could prepare for a patient with gunshot trauma to the abdomen, a serious injury requiring immediate surgical intervention if Junior was going to survive beyond initial stabilization. The producer's questions about what had happened were met with Willie's barely coherent explanations, his attempts to describe the accident becoming tangled in shock, and his growing recognition that any description would sound like an excuse or rationalization for shooting someone through carelessness that no amount of experience could justify. Junior's moments of consciousness during the boat ride included questions about what had happened and expressions of pain that were heartbreaking to hear from someone who'd always been tough and uncomplaining, despite decades of dangerous work that regularly produced minor injuries but never anything approaching this level of trauma. Willie's attempts to reassure Junior that he'd be okay and that help was coming felt hollow and inadequate, his words unable to address the reality that Junior's survival was uncertain and that even if he lived, he might face permanent damage to organs or mobility that would end his ability to work boats and fundamentally alter his life because of a split second when Willie's quick draw had targeted the wrong body. The handoff to paramedics at the boat launch was chaotic and terrifying. The EMT's professional assessment confirmed this was critical trauma requiring immediate transport to a trauma center in New Orleans rather than a closer but less capable local hospital. Their decision meant additional delay before surgical intervention could begin, but also meant Junior would receive care from specialists experienced in treating gunshot wounds and complex abdominal trauma. Willie's attempt to ride in the ambulance was denied. The paramedics' position was that family members would interfere with their work, and that Willie needed to follow in a separate vehicle, a separation that felt like punishment but was standard protocol designed to give medical teams space to work without emotional complications from relatives watching treatment. At University Medical Center's trauma unit, the wait was measured in hours that felt like days. Willie, little Willie, and other family members who had rushed to New Orleans sat in the waiting room while surgeons worked to repair damage that initial imaging showed was extensive but potentially survivable, if Junior's body could withstand the stress of multiple operations needed to address perforated intestines, damaged blood vessels, and other trauma caused by the shotgun blast. The surgical team's updates were technical and carefully neutral, doctors providing information about procedures without offering reassurance or predictions, because Junior's survival remained uncertain and complications could emerge at any point during recovery that would turn successful surgery into eventual death from infection or organ failure. When the law comes to the Bayou, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries investigators arrived at Willie's home 2 days after the shooting, not for a friendly chat about safety protocols or recommendations, but to conduct a criminal Investigation into whether Willie's actions constituted negligent injury with a firearm, a charge carrying potential prison time if prosecutors determined his shooting of Junior represented reckless disregard for safety rather than a simple accident that could happen to anyone despite reasonable precautions. The investigators had already reviewed the Swamp People footage, their frame-by-frame analysis reaching conclusions similar to what Willie himself had recognized: his failure to verify the target and his reliance on assumptions rather than visual confirmation before discharging a weapon. Their questions were pointed and skeptical, their demeanor making clear they viewed Willie's quick-draw technique as fundamentally unsafe and as exactly the kind of reckless behavior that justified criminal prosecution rather than administrative citations. They asked why Willie hadn't taken time to ensure Junior was clear before firing, why he had developed a technique that prioritized speed over crew safety, whether Swamp People cameras and the pressure to create dramatic footage had influenced his decision-making in ways that made the accident more likely or even inevitable given the risks he was taking to maintain his reputation as Louisiana's fastest hunter. Willie's answers were honest, but probably didn't help his legal situation. His acknowledgement that he'd been focused on being fast and hadn't consciously verified Junior's position before firing was exactly the kind of admission prosecutors could use to demonstrate criminal negligence rather than simple accident. His lawyer's advice to stop talking and invoke his right to counsel came too late to prevent damage, Willie's natural inclination toward honesty and genuine remorse overriding legal strategy that would have served his interests better than a confession that he'd prioritized speed and showmanship over basic safety protocols that should govern any situation involving weapons capable of killing human beings. The potential charges Willie faced included negligent injuring, carrying up to 6 months in prison and substantial fines, with his commercial hunting licenses subject to revocation if convicted, effectively ending his gator hunting career regardless of whether he served actual prison time. More serious was the possibility that prosecutors could pursue aggravated battery charges if they determined Willie's conduct represented such extreme deviation from reasonable safety standards that it constituted criminal recklessness rather than simple negligence, charges carrying potential multi-year prison sentences that would destroy Willie's life even if he ultimately received a suspended sentence or probation rather than active incarceration. The civil liability was potentially even more devastating than criminal exposure. Junior's injuries and permanent disability created a basis for a lawsuit that could claim millions in damages, including medical expenses, lost wages, and pain and suffering that any jury would likely award given the sympathetic victim and clear evidence that Willie's recklessness had caused catastrophic injury that would affect Junior for the rest of his life. Willie's insurance would cover some potential judgment, but his personal assets, including his home, boats, and equipment, could all be seized to satisfy a judgment exceeding coverage limits, financial ruin being a realistic possibility if Junior or his family decided to pursue maximum damages rather than settling for whatever insurance would pay. Swamp People's network response: the network immediately suspended Willie's participation in the show pending investigation and resolution of potential criminal charges. Their position was that they couldn't continue featuring someone under criminal investigation for a shooting incident, regardless of how popular he had been with viewers or how many seasons he had successfully completed without previous safety incidents. The suspension was presented as temporary, but everyone understood it might become permanent if Willie was convicted or if public perception shifted against him in ways that made his continued participation a liability for a network trying to maintain family-friendly programming that wouldn't be associated with criminal recklessness or hunting practices that resulted in crew members being shot. Living with what cannot be undone, Junior survived the initial surgeries, but faced months of recovery and eventual acceptance that he would never fully regain the physical capabilities that had allowed him to work boats and perform the demanding labor gator hunting required. His injuries resulted in permanent mobility limitations and chronic pain that would make his previous life impossible, regardless of how much physical therapy he endured or how determined he was to return to work that had defined his identity since adolescence. Medical bills accumulated into hundreds of thousands of dollars despite insurance coverage, the costs threatening to bankrupt Junior's family and creating an additional layer of guilt for Willie, who watched his nephew's financial destruction being added to the physical and emotional trauma the shooting had caused. The criminal charges prosecutors eventually filed were reduced to misdemeanor negligent injuring, their assessment being that while Willie's conduct had been reckless, it didn't rise to the level of criminal battery requiring proof of intent or extreme indifference to human life. The plea agreement Willie's lawyers negotiated included a suspended jail sentence, substantial fine, completion of a firearms safety course, and probation, during which any violations would trigger the active incarceration that had been suspended. Most devastating was the loss of his commercial hunting licenses for 5 years, a prohibition that effectively ended his gator hunting career given his age and the time required to rebuild an operation after such an extended absence from an industry where relationships and current knowledge were essential for success. Willie's decision about whether he could ever return to gator hunting was complicated by his recognition that he could never again trust himself with a bang stick, that the muscle memory and reflexes that had made him Louisiana's fastest hunter had also made him dangerous to anyone working alongside him in situations where split-second timing meant the difference between a successful kill and catastrophe. The thought of being on a boat with crew members and having a weapon in his hands triggered anxiety and flashbacks to the moment Junior fell backward with blood spreading across his shirt, psychological trauma making it unclear whether Willie could function as a hunter even if his licenses were eventually restored and even if he could convince anyone to work with him after what had happened. The relationship with Junior was irreparably damaged, despite Junior's eventual statements that he didn't blame Willie for an accident he characterized as terrible luck rather than as proof of his uncle's recklessness or disregard for safety. The forgiveness Junior offered felt unearned to Willie, his nephew's generosity making the guilt worse rather than better because accepting forgiveness required believing he deserved it when the evidence of his carelessness made such belief impossible. Their interactions became brief and awkward, decades of easy familiarity replaced by painful awareness of permanent disability that Willie had caused and that no amount of remorse or financial compensation could undo. Little Willie's relationship with his father was similarly damaged, the son's anger about Willie's recklessness complicated by love and recognition that Willie was genuinely devastated by what had happened, but that devastation didn't change the fact that Junior's life had been destroyed by a preventable accident that occurred because Willie prioritized being fast over being safe. The generational conflict about hunting techniques, which had previously been manageable disagreement, became a fundamental breach. Little Willie's position was that his father's old-school approach had proven dangerous, and that continuing to celebrate or defend such methods was disrespectful to Junior and to everyone who had warned Willie for years that his quick-draw technique would eventually result in exactly the kind of tragedy that had occurred. Swamp People's eventual decision was not to renew Willie's contract even after criminal charges were resolved. The network's position was that the shooting had created too much controversy, and that Willie's segment ratings had declined as viewers struggled to watch him hunt after learning about the accident and his history of prioritizing speed over safety. The termination was presented as mutual, but everyone understood Willie had been fired. His career as a television personality ended because of 3 seconds when his legendary quick draw had found the wrong target, destroying everything he had built across 4 decades of hunting and over a decade of successful appearances on television that had made him wealthy and famous beyond anything his grandfather could have imagined when teaching him to hunt gators in these same bayous generations earlier. The final reckoning for Willie, accepting that his need to be the fastest hunter had cost him everything: his nephew's health, his career, his reputation, his family relationships, and his own peace of mind that could never be restored. Because the shooting proved that his confidence in his abilities had been arrogance that justified itself through successful kills but had always been one small error away from catastrophe that his experience and reflexes couldn't prevent once circumstances aligned wrong and muscle memory executed an action faster than his conscious mind could recognize the error and abort the sequence. Some lessons can only be learned through tragedy, and Willie Edwards learned, at age 60, that being fast means nothing if you're shooting the wrong target, that decades of successful hunting create no immunity against the consequences of carelessness, and that some moments cannot be undone, no matter how desperately you wish you could have those 3 seconds back to do differently and to verify the target before trusting reflexes that had finally, catastrophically failed him. If this story affected you, share your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us whether you believe Willie's need for speed was worth the price he ultimately paid. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another raw, untold chapter from the world of swamp people.